Okay, let's start. Fine. So, fine. Last we have seen about hello servlet, and where we have only used servlet response. Fine. We used servlet response, and also we used get servlet config in that method get servlet config, and to get the object of servlet config. Okay, let's look further. Like see, so far what we have seen, and let's just list the from the API's point of view whatever we have seen. So we have seen not the whole thing, but a part of the servlet context, and this is what we have seen, part of it, and not the whole of the API, and mainly related to what are the things in servlet context that we have seen. It allows us to get us the first thing was display name. Fine, there's that method called get servlet context name. Then fine, from the context param, if you want to get anything, we have the method called those two methods, get init parameter names and get init parameter. Fine, method names are get init parameter. Fine. Okay. Then what else from servlet context? It represents a web application, right? Yeah. What else? Getting. Yeah. From servlet context object, yes. What else can we get? Server info. Okay. So version. What else? This is my application object. Okay. Getting the real path. Fine. For a URL, you give a URL relative to your root of the application. Fine. Start with slash. Okay. Then yeah. Resources. How do we get the resources? Okay. One is any resource which is part of your application. Fine. You can give a path relative to the root of the application starting with a slash. Okay. And you can have an input stream created for it to read from that resource. Fine. So get resource as stream. And that was another method. Yeah. Then getting the request dispatcher. Fine. Request dispatcher again starting with a slash. Fine. Give a resource path. Fine. A path. Now that path could even be a path which is in the URL mapping. Fine. Your servlet mapping. It could be from there also. Fine. Or it could be some static content also. Okay. Fine. Then what else? Get resource list. Fine. Get resource list. Okay. Fine. We made a correction. I think get resource list. It would return a string array. Okay. Fine. Directory listing for a given path. Okay. And request dispatcher. There was one more way of getting a request dispatcher. Named dispatcher, where you use a servlet name which appears in the web.xml, the name of the servlet. Okay, fine. So this is what we know, right? Okay, so you can get a request dispatcher for a given servlet or for any resource. Fine. How do we use it basically? Okay. So you are getting a request dispatcher, that's one thing. Now before going into that, see what you will be able to do given a request dispatcher. Okay, let's see this again. We have a request coming from the client, request and response objects being created. Okay, and then these are made available to a particular servlet. Fine, I'm not showing the servlet context here. So they are made available to a particular servlet, fine, which is the resource identified according to the URL. And according to the URL, it has identified, and that's my first servlet. Okay. So this servlet is getting the request and response objects, which have been created by the container. Okay. And then this resource here, this servlet here, decides that no, rest of the response can now be actually, I've done my processing part, but the response can be given by another resource. I'll not give the response. Let me shift the responsibility to some other resource. Fine. And that's where it creates a request dispatcher. So it's a request dispatcher which is created, and to the request dispatcher, these two objects are given. Okay, those two objects of request and response need to be passed on to the request dispatcher. Okay, fine. So how this is done? Yeah, so once from a servlet context, you have used one of those two methods, get named dispatcher or get request dispatcher. You got a request dispatcher. Now in request dispatcher, there are two things we actually can do. Okay, in request dispatcher, we got a method, both of them returning void, public methods anyway, because that's an interface. The method, one method is forward, where parameters are, again, two parameters. Which are the two parameters? Servlet request, and second parameter is our servlet response. And this also has the throws for IO exception and servlet exception. So one method is forward, and another method is, there are two methods here in the request dispatcher. One method is forward, the other method is include. And same two parameters, same signature. And let's understand the difference between them, what they are for. And normally you might be using the forward method, okay, because you normally distribute the work. Processing done by servlet 1, sending a response or generating a response, it's not sending, rather it's generating an output, so that may be a second servlet. Fine, we just divide that, right? But sometimes you might do something like this. Okay, let's see what exactly is the difference. So that's my servlet 1, right, which has created a request dispatcher, which is here, and that's your request dispatcher, and that's your servlet. Okay, fine. So servlet forwards to a request dispatcher. Whenever servlet forwards to a request dispatcher, the first thing it will do is it will reset the response. It does a resetting of response, which would require that. So your forward would fail if the response has been committed, and then you say, let me forward. Okay, forward means the entire responsibility of giving the response is not mine. It's the next guy. It's a request dispatcher. Fine. Servlet 1 is doing this. Okay. Servlet 1 is saying, I'm not going to be responsible for the response part. That's to be taken care by the other resource, which I have identified using a request dispatcher. I have created a request dispatcher for the other servlet. Okay. So that's the one who is going to give the response. Fine. So response part, reset and do whatever you like. Okay. If it has been committed, no, you can't do a forward. Forward would fail. It will throw an exception. If response is already committed, forward would throw an exception. Fine. And what is include in? Include is something like this. Include is, our servlet has already put some response there. It's put some content into it. And then it is saying, this particular resource also generates some response. Let me include that response also in this. So it's like, it is asking this request dispatcher, you append your things into my response object. Okay, once it has finished, this guy can still do more things. It can still be adding more response to it. It has started writing into the buffer, and then it is saying, let me include this. Let me include the content generated by the other resource. That's what the include is about. It's not going to reset. Forward, it's resetting. Forward means no. First servlet, nothing will be taken about whatever you might have tried to put in the response part. Response is coming from the request dispatcher only. Clear? The difference between the two of them, include and forward. Fine. So normally we use a forward. We don't like what we do is we do processing in our servlet 1, and then we have our servlet 2, whose only job is okay, show a response, put the response into it, put the content, fine, generate a content. First part, I have received the parameters, I have received so much of information from the request. Let me do the processing part. Okay, presentation part, how to present that response. Okay, someone knows about presentation, that's the second part. Okay, and if you are working on presentations and on giving a good presentation, that would mean you should be knowing what? Good amount of HTML. Fine, because our responses are going to be HTML based, so good amount of HTML should be known. Fine, and therefore this second resource normally would be something called a JSP. JSPs are also servlets. We'll see that later. And we'll realize that, yes. And so servlet does its processing and forwards to a JSP. I don't generate a response, or that tags and everything, what tags should be given in the presentation is part of the JSP. It's not my thing. So you normally use a forward. Servlet receives a request, does a processing, and forwards to a JSP to give a response. And that's a normal sequence. Clear? Request dispatcher. Now, another thing. Okay, now this may require some configuration changes in whatever container you are using. Okay, but we do have in servlet context. Let me talk of one more method which we haven't seen earlier. Okay, in servlet context, because this is your communication with the container. In this container, we understand it's not just one application which has been deployed. There are multiple applications which have been deployed. Okay, so there are multiple servlet context objects. Okay, so what we have here, I'm talking about a method in servlet context. Servlet context has a method to return a servlet context. Method name is get servlet context. Okay, and parameter is a string which is a URL corresponding to a web application. Again, should start with a slash. This must start with a slash. Slash and application name. It's just nothing but a slash and a web application. Give me the servlet context for so and so web application which is currently there in your container, in the same container. You have an inventory application, you got a payroll application, same server. Fine, it's the same container having a payroll application, an inventory application, and for some reason, okay, payroll wants to use some part of inventory, some resource from inventory, yeah, to create a request dispatcher and forward there, right? I want to or include something from there. Yeah, what it can do, it will first need a servlet context object. If you have a servlet context, you can use get request dispatcher or get named dispatcher, and then you can forward. Okay, fine. But one thing, this particular method, for security reasons, normally returns null. Fine. For security reasons, this is normally going to be returning a null. What you need to do is, if you need this facility, fine, you will need to configure, and you'll have to look into the configuration which is specific to the type of container you are using, so that this gets enabled for your application. So not all applications would be allowed to have access to the other applications. Okay. Fine. So that's one thing. Fine. So for like, okay, if you are going to use Tom, so this is going to be becoming more container specific then. Okay, that configuration part. Otherwise, yes, the API has that method called get Servlet Context. And Servlet Context has a method called get Servlet Context. Fine, request dispatcher is okay. Okay, how to forward and find the forward and include part, and being able to get hold of another web application. At least the API provides a method. Normally it returns null. In most of the containers, for security reason, it will return a null. Fine, but then we do have configuration part. Fine, where it can be, so for a particular application, it can be enabled that in this application, yes, it's allowed to, he's allowed to have access to the other web applications. Okay, and that's how basically some applications, like if you have seen Tomcat, you've seen actually there's an application called Manager, which is managing all the other applications. Fine. So that's having just those kind of privileges. It's just because that particular application called Manager has been configured to be allowed for having access to other applications. So if you write your application, yes, you can go and make changes in the configuration and configure it so that, yes, it gets all those privileges. Okay, but again, container specific. If you are talking about Tomcat, yes, there will be one way of doing it. Okay, fine. Not through web.xml. It's not in web.xml. Okay, so fine, let's look at the next thing. Now, okay, so what we have seen so far, we have seen Servlet Context, part of Servlet Context. Okay, today we saw about request dispatcher. Fine, earlier we have seen the Servlet interface, 5 methods, we have implemented that. Fine, so that's one another thing. We have also seen about, what else? Servlet config. Fine, in this 4 methods, and this is 5 methods, this is 4 methods. And then we also saw about Servlet response. Fine, we have seen this already. Fine, Servlet response was mainly about managing the buffer. Okay, there is a metadata for the type of content which is being put in the buffer. Fine. Okay, so all those things, that's there in the Servlet response. Fine, that we have seen. Now let's look at Servlet request. Okay, so we look at Servlet request now. Okay, some of the commonly used methods from Servlet request. Yeah, so fine, we might try to relate with a request, a standard request which we get. Yeah, what are the things which we get in a request? Okay, but that specific, that method is specific to HTTP. Okay, this part of the API, what we are looking at currently is the javax.servlet package, is not specific to any protocol. Fine, but then we still have a few things. Fine, it's, you are giving a URL, it's based on URLs only, right? Since you are giving a URL, you are always talking about a resource. Okay, plus in this URL, fine, because the URL has come, in this URL there is what are the parts of this URL from the point of view of our container, what the container needs to identify. First, what does it need to identify? Localhost is identified. That's why there's a mechanism how you have reached, the client has reached the container, right? And then onwards, what is it that the container, once you have identified, the client has identified the container, okay, what is there in the URL? What's the first part? What's the first part of the URL? That's a protocol. Okay, you can still talk about that. So servlet request has method called get protocol. Okay, yeah, it would return a string, whether it is HTTP 1.0, 1.1, right? Okay, there's another one called get scheme, that also returns a string. That's the part of the URL we are talking about, HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, or whatever it may be. Fine. Okay, fine. What else in that URL? Yeah, what else do we have? Okay, host, all those things. Okay, fine. Host is something, yes, which has been there. So we have from servlet request. Okay, there are a few methods here. You can get information related to the TCP/IP connection which has been done. See, the client has made a TCP/IP connection. So related to the TCP/IP connection, there is information available in the servlet request. So servlet request will have methods for getting who's the client. Okay, so get remote host to return a string. Fine. You can say get remote host, you can use get remote address. Also a string, get remote port to return an integer value. Fine. The port number used on the client side. Fine. Client would have some port number. Fine. To make a connection, it needs a port, right? Socket connection is done using a port. Okay. So the host and port which has made a connection to this server. Okay. There's one more thing which you can try to understand here. Many places, okay, you might have some configuration which goes like this. You might have configured an Apache server, just a simple Apache server to receive requests, and then from Apache server it will go to Tomcat, your web container. Okay, Apache server can take care of the static part, but wherever it comes to servlet or any such things, okay, those things will be passed on to the container which we are looking at. So this is our container. Okay, fine. So this is what we call as server, because this is the server to the client. Fine, the one who receives the URL first. Fine, and then some of those things, when it comes to a servlet or JSP or anything related to the, which is related to Java, fine, it might then pass it on to the container. That's also something which is allowed. So we have two different things. These may be different machines altogether. Okay, so this one, right, we are talking about API which is working here, and that's a place where we have our Java code working, and so our API is there. So we do have something like get server host, get server address. I think, yeah, it's get server address to return a string, and get server port to return an integer value. Fine. There's also a get local address and get local port. Local address is your string and local port is an integer value. Fine, we understand what is this local. Local refers to the container. Server, it could be same as container. Fine, if it's directly coming to a container, or if you got some HTTP server where all requests are first received, fine, then it would be the server here refers to that HTTP server. Okay, so information related to TCP IP, fine, related to the connection. Yeah, using the host and port, the connection was done. What else? What follows there? So we got the scheme. Fine. This information, because this was used for making a connection. So from connection related information, right? Here your get local port normally would be 8080 if it's if the configuration has not been changed for the Tomcat. Okay, your container. Fine. It's that one, and that's the local port. Okay. Yeah. Then what's the next part? What's the first part? The application. Fine. So the resource, see, resource is what has been sent to the container. Container has received a resource, full path of the resource. The very first part of the resource is used for identifying application, the web application. There is a servlet context corresponding to it. Fine. So we have this method called get context path. It returns a string. What is the context path? This will be returning a string which is of the form slash and your application name. Okay, the first part. Okay, some method names may not be exact. Fine, we'll have to just look in the API further. Yeah. So get context path is okay the part of the URL which identifies your application. What's the next part? Next part. Suppose you have a path based, right? Fine. In that case, we have certain part of that path which has been used for identifying which servlet to be used. How did it identify the servlet to be used? Oh, because you have slash hello in the beginning, right? You might have written slash hello. Let's say after the application name, slash hello, slash something, there might be a long thing, right? But which part of it identified the servlet? That was your slash hello. Fine, that was sufficient to identify, oh, that's a servlet to be used. So that much, fine, you get that part of it, that part of your URL by using the method get servlet path. Okay, exact method names we'll have to just verify. It might be get servlet path only. Yeah, it should be. Okay, and then the additional part, fine. You have some additional things because after slash hello, oh, there was some more information. Okay. Okay. So there's some method, I'm not remembering the exact name, get path info. I think it is get path info again to return a string. Okay, the part which is after the path which was used for identifying the servlet. So after slash hello, whatever remains, the rest of it is here. Fine, you have a URL pattern where everything has matched. In that case, this will be an empty string. There's nothing additional. You had a servlet name as hello1. You had a mapping of servlet name hello1 and you have said, okay, slash hello, fine, a fixed URL. It's not a wildcard. You have just said slash hello. Now, what is your servlet path? Slash hello. Because slash hello was used for identifying the servlet. Okay, what is the additional, and is there any additional thing after that? No. So when someone says get path info, there's nothing. It's a blank string, empty string. Fine. Okay, when you use fixed URL, okay, there you will have this one being blank, empty string, path info. Path info would be available if you have your wildcards. Yeah. Yes. Okay, and then fine. Now, again, not being protocol specific, whatever the protocol, there can be a mechanism of passing the parameters. Fine, there can be a mechanism of passing parameters as part of a request. Your request can include some parameters. Fine, for HTTP protocol, we understand our URL can have question mark and parameters being passed on. Fine, a query string can be there, part of your URL. Fine, question mark, some parameter name equal to value and another parameter name equal to value. So you can have multiple parameters over there. So we got methods to extract those parameters and getting those parameters. Okay, so there can be method for extracting the parameters. So method like, okay, let's look at the methods further. So we got method like, yeah, get parameter names, it would return enumeration of string. Fine, getting all the parameter names. Okay, fine. We can have get parameter values, which takes as parameter a string for the parameter name, and it returns a string array. We also have method called get parameter, which again takes a string for the parameter name and returns a string. See the two methods, both take a parameter name. Fine. One returns a single value, the other one would return an array. Fine. Any parameter can have multiple values. Fine. A parameter may have multiple values. Fine. And therefore that first method which I have written, get parameter values. When you use get parameter, it will return just the first value out of it. Okay, only the first value will be returned. Fine, but any parameter can have multiple values. Yeah, you have a parameter name. Your query string can be something like saying yeah, p1 equal to some value and p1 equal to another value. Same parameter can have multiple values. Fine, you're creating a form. There is an HTML form. In the HTML form, fine, for the elements input, we have name equal to, and that's becoming a parameter name. Okay, for an input element, a name is becoming a parameter name. IDs have to be unique, but not the names. You can repeat the same name. Fine. So you are getting multiple values for the same parameter name. You will get it in the form of an array. You'll get all the values. Fine. Yeah, so we got an enumeration of all the parameter names and like this, and you want all this information in one single place. So we do have a method to return a map of string. The string here is a parameter name with a string array. The corresponding parameter values. Name of the method is get parameter map. All the parameters mapped to their values. One place. And a structure containing parameters mapped to their parameter values. So all parameters with their values is available here in this map. Fine. So we can have, it can have parameters. Fine. A request, we understand, can have content being sent, right? There can be content which is part of the request. Okay, you're uploading a file or something. So there can be content which is part of the request. So you will have methods which can describe the content. So you can have method called get content type to return a string. Get the type of content. Okay, there's one more method which we have skipped probably. Yeah, when we talked of the resource, right, and the path. Okay, we have seen the path and the various parts. Those are the various parts, right? But the whole of the resource, the URL, the entire URL, fine, excluding the scheme part, but the entire path is available to you by using a method called get request or requested resource. URL, sorry, get requested URL. It would return a string buffer. And see, this is not returning a string, it's returning a string buffer. What's the difference in returning a string and string buffer? Yeah, what's the difference? Yeah, string buffer difference. What's the difference? String buffer is something which can be, is mutable. You can make changes. Now, a servlet receives a request Why would it like to change? How would it affect anything? Making changes in this URL. See, making changes in the URL, if they are, who will be able to see this? Who is it for? That I'll make changes in the URL. I'll make changes here in my request, which I have received from the container. This is something which is, who is it that this request is being shared with? Is this going to be shared with someone else now? Isn't it going to be shared with the server? Server is not going to do any processing for you, from the request at least. We saw something today, the request dispatcher. Oh, yeah, see, it's not just the servlet, right? This request which you have received is going to be passed on to another resource, another servlet probably. So anything you would like to, any changes which you make here is going to be available to the next one. You could, for example, you could look at this buffer, and in this you could probably append more parameters to it, because you understand there is a query string. You can try to verify there is a query string already or not. If it's not there, you can add a question mark, and you want to make some additional parameters, make the second servlet believe that there was some additional parameter which has come here. You can make changes in this URL before it reaches the second servlet, before you share it with the next one, before you do a forward or even an include. Fine. Setting up, manipulating the parameters is something which can be done. Fine, we can do manipulation of parameters. Clear? Okay, fine. We have some methods which are describing the content. Now I'll go to that part later, because since we have started this, fine. So we have one thing like, okay, we are sharing with the request dispatcher some information. So we have got the requested URL as a string buffer, which can be changed. Now see, what is being shared? The request object and the response object. Response object, anyway, if you are forwarding, it's going to be reset. So we don't do anything with the response object. But there's something we can do with the request object. The first servlet, what it has done, it has received the request. It has seen the parameters. It has done its processing part. It has accessed the database, fetched the information. It has all the information. But I don't deal with the presentation aspect. I'm not going to deal with the presentation aspect. Someone else has to do the presentation. But whatever results I have got has to be made available to the next one. I've got my results in the form of Java objects. The results are some Java objects. Right? Okay, fine. These are some Java beans. Fine, simple getter setter methods. And these are some things which I would like to make available to the second one. How? What is being shared? The request object is being shared. I'm passing the same request object to the request dispatcher, and therefore our servlet request has methods for managing attributes. 4 methods, recollect. In servlet context also, we have those 4 methods. 4 methods. Fine, it's the same set of 4 methods we have. What are those 4 methods? Set attribute, takes as parameter a string for the attribute name, and second is the object. Okay, the object to be set, and this is set. Okay, then we have the get attribute, which takes a name and returns a string. Right? We have the get attribute names to return an enumeration of string and remove attribute. Yeah, takes a string attribute name, returns void. Fine, managing attributes is something which we can do in the request. We can do it in servlet context. Fine. But for the processing of this request, whatever is there, and I need to share with the other servlet, I'll pass it through a servlet request. So servlet request is place for managing attributes also. Okay. Fine, clear? For the purpose of sharing, fine, get request URL or requested URL, just verify that method name, it might be requested URL, returning a string buffer, and then we have these things. Managing attributes. Fine, useful mainly because we are using, we are able to use a request dispatcher. And of course, there's one more method here, okay, but I would, okay, slightly tricky this method. Okay, there is also the method called get request dispatcher available here also. Takes a string, find some URL to return a request dispatcher. We have this method called get request dispatcher in servlet request. We had this in servlet context. The difference between the one which is there in servlet context and the one which is there in servlet request. In servlet context, the string which you pass must always start with a slash. Here it's not compulsory. Okay, here it's not compulsory. And if you use a slash, that slash which we use here is not the root of the application. It is the root. Means slash something, what you give here is nothing but your application then. You could be giving slash and another application. You could be entering another application through this. If you are starting with a slash. Okay, here if you start with a slash, that's the root, not the root of the application. Root of the server, where you start your application. Okay, and if you don't start with a slash, it is relative to the current URL. Fine, if you don't start with, you are allowed not to start with a slash. It is relative to the current URL. So if it is at the same level as the path here, fine, you can just give just the last part. Okay, it's relative to the current URL if you don't start with a slash. You're allowed not to start with a slash in this case. Okay, fine. So we do have a request, get request dispatcher to return a request dispatcher. Okay, now let's talk about the content part. Yeah, our request may have a content. So if it has a content, one of the methods which we mentioned earlier was about the get content type. What type of content? You have the method called get content length. To return int value. getting the content length, or you could also have some information about the user's preferences in terms of get locales and a method called get locale. Get locales, I think, returns an array of locale, not an enumeration. Mostly it's an array. And get locale returns a single object of locale. Right? The language country settings. So preferences of the client. There's nothing but this lets you know the preference of the client. This is coming through headers. The information for HTTP protocol, this comes through headers. So there's information about the user's preference related to the language and country settings. So in this, if you are going for that get locales, you're getting an array and gives us the choice. The first preference is the 0th element. The second preference is the first element in the array. Fine, so you have said, okay, my first priority would be, I want things to be in Gujarati, India. But if not Gujarati, maybe I'll prefer Hindi as my second preference. And third preference could be English then. Maybe that's something someone can say. Fine, so that can be get locales. It's information from the client. Okay, fine. And then, now reading the content part. Fine, if you want to read the content part, in the request there is a buffer which you will like to read. The content type will indicate whether it's a binary or a text. If it's a text content, you would like to read the content using a reader, and if it's a binary content, you would like to read the content using an input stream. Okay, but one more setting which is available before that, though it should not normally be used. Okay, there is a setter method available here. Okay, fine. We have the method. This method is fine. This is a getter method also. We have the method called get character encoding. Okay, to return a string. So this is like, the client has sent us the information about what character encoding. It's a text content which is there. So what kind of character encoding has been followed? But suppose this is missing. Okay, if this information is missing, what is the character encoding? The client has not set it. Fine. The container by default would use Latin 1 character set. So I'm not interested in using Latin 1. I would like to use a different setting. So you are allowed to have a set character encoding usage where you specify what character set name you would like to use. So you're allowed to do this. Okay, but don't do this if that one is not returning a null. The get character encoding is returning some value, then stick with that. Get character encoding is something what the user has specified. From the request, what are we getting? Okay, fine. We'll see where that get character encoding is useful. Okay, or your setting, where the setting would be used. So if the content is a text content, then only the question of character encoding comes. Okay, so if it's a text content, okay, you are going to use a reader. Fine. So we have the method called get reader to return a buffered reader. Now this buffered reader will follow which encoding? Before you create the get buffered reader, fine, before you call the get buffered reader, if you are changing the character encoding, set character encoding is being used, do it before this. Do it before calling the get reader method. Okay, it has to be done before the getReader method, so that the correct encoding is followed by this reader, buffered reader. Fine. So it's this buffered reader which would by default use a 88591 or Latin one. Okay, and then if it's a binary content, the method is get input stream to return the object of servlet input stream. We have the class called servlet input stream, which extends from the input stream. Yeah. And so this can allow us to read the buffer part. The content which has come from the client can then be read. Clear? Okay, so that's a servlet request. Okay, so now we can have some more exercises. Fine, we can have more exercises. So we should have what? We have seen the methods of servlet request. We have seen some of the methods of servlet context. Right? Now just have a simple servlet which would just give information from all these places. Okay, there's so much of information. So from the request, I have seen all these things. I found these parameters. So try to use these methods. Have a method called info servlet. Fine, have a servlet called info servlet. So create one servlet called info servlet by implementing the servlet interface. Fine, we can still be implementing the servlet interface. Okay. Yeah. Fine. Okay. We'll continue tomorrow. Tomorrow, I think we'll still look at another thing. Yeah, we'll have those servlet. I'll just try to put one more. I'll demonstrate one servlet which we'd like to create. Okay, so that we don't have to keep on implementing the servlet interface each time. Fine, just see. Fine, we'll see what we can do. Fine, we'll develop our own servlet for that. Yeah.
In case of fixed mapping, fixed IP.
Yeah. Fixed URL.
Fixed URL.
Yeah. In case of a fixed URL, yeah.
How can we proceed to real path, finding the real path?
Okay, real path has nothing to do with the what is the URL pattern. Once a servlet has been identified, whatever way, right? Fine. Now what you are saying, what the real path is about. What the real path is saying is that relative to your wherever the application has been deployed. Within your application, you have your application folder. Within your application folder, you are giving some kind of a path. Okay, give me this path in terms of physical path. Convert it into a physical path, not slash something which starts from application. Right? So where is this application deployed? On Tomcat. Fine. Within Tomcat, where is my application folder? It is in web apps. Where is Tomcat? I'm not sure. Fine. I'm just taking example of Tomcat. Just like Tomcat, it could be some other server, and they may not be having an application folder called web apps. They may have named it something else. Fine. Some other container has its own needs. But wherever physically there is going to be your folder, and it lies somewhere on your file system. So this gets converted to that path. And converting into that real path, which is the physical path on the file system. That is what the get real path is. Right? Okay, fine, continue tomorrow.